hope you're settling well in the country. How are things there? It's actually gotten pretty dark and chilly down here, so I hope you're adaptable to that sort of thing. Anyway, small talk aside, I decided to write to you for the sake of trying to patch things up between us. It doesn't really matter what Mom and Dad think. You're still their little girl, and I know better than to jump to conclusions the way they do. I suppose I should also add that this is because I very desperately need your help. I suppose, in a way, I'm writing this for me as well, in case I somehow ever let myself forget. The only issue there is that the more I try, the fresher it feels. This story isn't about me, though. It's about Nana. I know you were told not to be here. Don't worry about it. It was just me anyway. In any case, I don't expect anyone bothered giving you the details. If they have, feel free to skip the next bit. January 16th was the day I found an anonymous letter in my post. It didn't have a return address, so I assumed someone slid it through by hand. What it did have was the word jelly on the front. I know you remember Nana calling me Jelly from when we used to go to her place. When I opened it, I could barely manage to slide it out of the envelope without tearing it. Most of it was brittle and splotched with a dark ink. I tried to make out what I could, but if this was Nana, she might have shambled out of bed and written it in the middle of the night. There wasn't really that much on the paper itself. Most of it seemed blank. Hardly a scratch on it. When I ran my mind across it, I could just barely feel the faintest bump of impression among what was mostly just a soggy mess. I held it up and squinted. Ready was the only word that survived, and it was at the end of the page. Before I even started looking for anything else of use, the phone rang. I took the paper inside and answered, only to find the police on the other end. They were calling to inform me that a Jane Doe was brought into the morgue some time ago, but they were recently given reason to believe that the person was a relative of mine and they needed me to identify her. At that point, I was barely listening, but the description over the phone checked all the boxes. I could feel the phone slip from my fingers as I squeezed the letter in my other hand. Nana's last words, gone. Some of the ink began to wash through and trickle into my palm. It could have drowned me for all I cared. Shaking like a jammed printer, I got dressed and went to my car. Bad idea. I couldn't even get a key in the ignition without soaking it in sweat. The tiny part of my brain that was still able to reason decided that I should just call a cab. Soon enough, I got to the city morgue. I didn't want to be there, but I was the only relative in town, and for some reason, part of me needed to see this through. It was snowing when I got out of the cab, but not enough just yet to cover the withering leaves coating the glistening tarmac outside the morgue grounds. The building stood by itself behind iron gates. It had odd red marbling and towering pillars. The classical architecture itself was being kept on ice. For whatever reason, whoever was in charge of the place must have either had money to burn or enjoyed whitening the sepulchre. Never before had I witnessed such a lively home for the dead. Surely tourists were the last thing they'd want to attract. Nonetheless, I dragged my feet toward the entrance, past a curious-looking fountain in the shape of a woman and a child, which was placed oddly to one side. The water flowing from the woman's mouth into the child sounded almost violent in my ears. The place itself was surprisingly clean. A commemorative bust of the founder loomed by the double-leafed entrance doors. The metal visage depicted an older man. He had a stethoscope around his neck and a high collar. The glasses which rested on a bulbous nose masked eyes, which were piercing but tired. I never did understand why anyone would willingly decide to found a walk-in refrigerator for the dead. Though, thinking again, I suppose the taste does help justify it. The morgue interior was just as eerie as I could have imagined, though it's not really the type of place anyone would willingly take in long enough to preserve a memory. It was quiet and sterile. As the doors swung shut behind me, the soft thud boomed throughout the corridors, only to be quickly masked by the pronounced click-clacking sound which grew louder as a woman dressed in white grew nearer. Her round glasses reflected the dull yellow light from the humming tube which hung overhead. Her raven hair was tied in a bun, revealing earrings which looked like what I could only guess might have been actual ravens. She seemed abnormally chirpy considering her surroundings. She introduced herself as Amelia, although I can't even remember whether I replied with my own name. We talked for a while, or at least she did, while I looked in her general direction. At one point, I asked her about the history of the place and she beamed. For a moment, I was almost ready to see her burst into song, but surprisingly, it yielded an entertaining enough conversation that actually took my mind off things for a while. It turns out that the founder meant for this place to be built on the tomb of his beloved sister. Her death drove him mad and led him to engaging in questionable engagements with the occult. Shortly before he died, it was discovered that his sister's body had been taken out of her resting place. A few days later, the founder buried himself in that same tomb, sealing himself off, taking the key with him to his grave. Amelia joked since people weren't sure where the entrance to the tomb was, she was always afraid she'd stumble upon it in her own way to the bathroom. She began laughing, but when I tried to lift the sides of my mouth, blood began rushing to my head. The discussion slowly stifled itself, and the girl produced a clipboard, which she gave to me. Filling in the details was more challenging than I'd expected. With my hand quivering above the vacant lines, it dawned on me that I didn't know much of anything about our grandmother. I had her eyes, I remembered, and her funny way of starting an angry sentence in soprano. About half an hour later, Amelia said I filled in enough details, though I don't remember a single word of it. She led me through a maze of narrow hallways and down some stairs. It was already starting to get dark out, but now there was nothing to guide me forward than a warm hand and a handful flickering of lights. I could feel my chest tighten every step. Eventually, Amelia took out a key and unlocked a small door at the end of a brick hallway. She offered her condolences again and left to give me some privacy. I froze. The first thing that hit me was the smell. The scent of death clung to my clothes the minute they made contact. It was masked by only whatever chemicals they used to keep the bodies fresh. It was a small room. I saw the refrigeration units lining the walls, and I felt like it was my first day in a hotel room. I so desperately wanted to open every one of them up and see what was inside. No such luck. The body in question was already out in the open. I felt hands and feet go numb as I stepped closer. She was toe-tagged, of course. I couldn't help but staring at her face. Strands of whitened hair fell past the bed's surface like an ethereal waterfall. Her mouth was purple, almost blackened. I wasn't sure if it was the angle she was put in, but the sides of her cheeks were sagging and pulling at her lips. She seemed to be enjoying it. She reminded me of you. Her skin was pale, almost bleached out. I wasn't sure what had happened to it, but that was her skin, all right. I ran my finger across her forehead, pulling away as I remembered I was still covered in ink. I heard a knock on the door, followed by the creaking of metal as it slowly swung open. Amelia's head peered through, and I questioned how long I'd been there. She asked if everything was all right. I nodded, barely looking at her. I glanced toward the bed where Nana was resting. She was thin enough that it could probably hold 2 people. Do you remember her sleeping next to us when we were ill? I wanted to return that kindness, but I was stopped by the hand placed on my shoulder. I lowered my head and left. Amelia was kind enough to call me a cab, and I made my way home. Along the way, I decided to call the morgue and ask for her. I wanted to know how exactly they knew to contact me. I wasn't sure if she'd explained already, but something told me she didn't mind repeating herself. Amelia answered. She took a deep breath and reminded me that they found out during the initial examination. They found pieces of paper lodged in her throat, which they were able to make out to be a letter. It had my name on it, but the rest was nearly dissolved. I ran up the steps of my house, rushing to find the remnants of the letter I crushed earlier. When I got to the door, I reached for my key. Gone. They were either inside the house or back at the morgue. I was too out of it to remember, and it was getting too dark to wait around outside. My last stroke of luck that evening came when I turned to find the cab driver answering the phone, still parked. I went back in and asked to go back to the morgue. By the time I arrived, it was already dark, the lights spilling from the street lamps pushed longingly against the cold, thickening fog. I hurried past the gates and the fountain, spotting Amelia just past the front entrance. I explained that I might have misplaced my keys, and she reminded me how to get back down to Nana's unit. She invited me to go ahead, as someone needed to lock up down there anyway. Once more, I found myself face to face with her. I could see her smiling through her yellow teeth. She must have been happy to see me. I scanned the floor, but nothing was out of the ordinary. I looked underneath tables and gurneys, but with no luck. Thinking again, I wasn't sure I remembered seeing Nana's teeth for the first time. I stepped forward, running my fingers through her hair. The light in here is quite dim, but if I squinted, I could make out the tiniest sign of white behind her teeth. I looked behind my shoulder, but no one was there. I decided to lock the door just to be safe. If anyone found me tampering with a corpse, I could be in trouble. I decided to use my cleaner hand out of respect. Her jaw made a creaking sound when I moved it. The inside of her mouth was cold but sticky. I remembered she'd pretended her spoon was a fairy when she used to feed me as a child. My hand was too big. I extended my index and middle fingers instead, hoping to snatch the tip. I couldn't tell what I caught, but I started to pull. I was pretty sure it wasn't her tongue, but you never know. Whatever it was putting up a fight. I looked in and saw I'd moved it a small amount, but whatever it was still stuck in there. I tried reaching further. I grabbed it, and her skull made a loud crack. Instinctively, I pulled my hand back. As I did, I dislodged what seemed to be a wet fabric of some kind from her throat, releasing the ink. A viscous black ink spewed forth from what was inside her mouth with such speed that it caused the rest of the body to arch upwards. My hand was out of the way, but I was still looking inside her mouth. The liquid caught me by surprise and I gasped, then choked as it flooded my own throat. I tried to pull back, but the hand on my shoulder stopped me. I glanced sideways to see a pale arm extended from beneath the sheets. I looked at Nana's face. Her beautiful yellow eyes pierced into my soul. They looked tired but loving. She smiled at me, and without even thinking, I smiled back. Nana loosened her grip and I fell to the floor. I grasped my throat with both hands and started hacking, but nothing came back out. There was a banging on the door. My eyes widened as I looked around in panic. My clothes were soaked through and there was no other exit. A male voice asked if I was ready. I looked at Nana, who nodded and pointed toward one of the handles on the walls. I went to open it. Empty. Perfect. I took off my shirt to throw it into the waste disposal and then my trousers. Metal clinked against the ground as I did. When I was finished, I climbed into the metal bed and closed the door behind me. I shut my eyes and waited, not sure of what I was hoping would happen. Eventually, the best thing that could happen did. I heard a click as the door to my bed opened once more. I saw Nana's bleached face smiling at me. She slid out of my bed halfway and crawled in with me. Another figure then emerged, though I wasn't sure where from. A new voice called out. "Are we ready?" they asked as they closed the door, sealing us in. I'm not sure how long I've been in here for, but I've had time to think about it and I'm still not sure. So that's why I need your help, Lucy. Would you mind helping me find my keys?